all for coming out on a cold winter's night in California, in sunny California. Except it really hasn't been for a while, has it? So, yeah, you're going to see later on in upcoming events. Well, you're not going to see actually, because I haven't got a title for it yet. But the guy's going to be coming out on April 6th to talk about water sustainability and the drought. I go well, this is not good timing. So I imagine myself calling him up and saying, John, he said, I just got to talk to you about your presentation. Sorry, I can't hear you very well. It's raining so hard outside. Anyway, what a year weather-wise, but we were lucky tonight, right? Because it's been raining for 7 days in a row, and then today, right? So it's the magic of MIT. Okay, so I'm Doug Sprang. I run the Energy and Environment series for the MIT Club, and I'm here to introduce Stefan Heck, who's going to be our speaker. Before I introduce him, however, what I want to also mention is that this is the kickoff of a new program that we're incorporating into the series called Transportation in the Bay Area, and it's going to focus particularly on things like autonomous vehicles, connectivity and sharing, and electric vehicles, all of which Dr. Heck will be talking about tonight, and then some. So he's kind of like setting the groundwork, if you will, for thinking about what is going on right now in the area of transportation, particularly in the area of technology. And he has a vision of how this is all coming together and converging to do something pretty dramatic. In other words, be a revolution in transportation. So Dr. Heck was born and raised in Austria, but I challenge you to detect a German accent in his speaking voice. So we'll see. I don't know what he did, but it's pretty amazing. He came to the U.S. by enrolling in Stanford in 1988, where he received a Bachelor of Science degree in Symbolic Systems in 1992. And while at Stanford, he started the Solar Car Project. So he's been in and around, renewable energy and things for quite a long time. By the way, he says that he only went to Stanford because he was rejected by his first choice, which was MIT. But what do they know, right? He went on to receive his PhD in cognitive science from UC San Diego, where his research there was on philosophy and cognitive science, the origin of representations, and deep learning. And deep learning, of course, is that artificial intelligence concept that is embedded into this whole area of autonomous vehicles and the like. He spent over 10 years at McKinsey, where he founded and led their clean tech and sustainability practice, during which time he consulted extensively with Global 100 companies in related industries. He returned to Stanford as a consulting professor with the Precourt Institute for Energy just a few years ago, teaching courses and conducting research on innovation, energy, and resource economics. So, but then he made a huge career change. He decided to experience what it's like to drive disruptive technology. And so he recently left Stanford and co-founded Notto, which is a Palo Alto-based autonomous vehicle software company, where he is their CEO. Meanwhile, he's also on the board of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, which, by the way, is a really important thing, because that group looks at policy and all kinds of things involving issues in and around the Bay Area, especially down south here. And of course, this is where most of the autonomous vehicle and the like is being developed and tried out. So anyway, looking at him today, as you see when he stands up and in his pictures you've seen in our promos, it's clear to anyone that A, he doesn't age, and B, he never sleeps. So, ladies and gentlemen, the MIT Club's Energy and Environment series proudly presents Dr. Stefan Heck on the impending revolution in transportation.
Thank you very much, Doug. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight in front of what surely is one of the smartest audiences I've presented to, given the number of MIT alums. And also, it's wonderful to be back in this auditorium. Actually, my career started here at Park when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. researcher here named Brian Smith gave me a grant to do my first work on neural networks, which at that time was a total academic backwaters that nobody paid attention to the way that deep learning gets all the buzz and attention today. So I'm delighted to tell you a little bit about what's coming in transportation. This is a blend of work I did at McKinsey, work I did as a Stanford professor, and then work I'm doing now as an entrepreneur. But really broadly, as Doug teed up, give you an overview of things that are coming. We'll touch on a lot of different areas, but obviously won't go deep into all of them. The first thing is, we all know we're in the hotbed of innovation here. But did you know that Silicon Valley actually used to be a hotbed of transportation innovation many, many years ago before we gave up that mantle? Now it's coming back again. If you look at transcontinental railroads, invented here, right? The first big suspension bridges, the first transcontinental air service, all actually started here in the Bay Area. And if you look at that disruption 100 years ago of those technologies, it completely changed life. People no longer lived and died within 20, 30 miles of where they were born. You could go cross-continent for a day trip, not just as a once-in-a-lifetime journey on a wagon train. Books suddenly became available to everybody, as opposed to being a Victorian luxury good that you could only afford if you were part of nobility. And of course, the market's globalized. We used to just have trade by a few sea routes. Now we have trade everywhere. We all take for granted that we can go to a store downtown Palo Alto and buy goods from all over the world, and many goods from China. So I tee this up because we've forgotten that there are a lot of transportation innovations here that we no longer have. This is the rail network in 1915. And you'll notice not only was there Caltrain, but there was an electric rail that went pretty close to here that took you all the way down to Cupertino. Electric, every half hour. Caltrain also was 2 minutes faster, yes, you heard me right, than it is today. And of course, that's with steam engines, right? Not with diesel electrics. So I tee all that up because we're on the cusp of another revolution like this, driven also by technology changes and new business models. But this one is tackling a different part of what's going on. We are looking fundamentally at a resource productivity shift in our energy and particularly in our transportation system. This is work that Lawrence Livermore has done since the 70s, plotting the energy flow through the US economy, a Sankey diagram. Many of you have probably seen this chart. There's two really shocking things about it. One is that if you look closely on the right-hand side, we waste more energy than we use in the entire economy. And the other part is this has gotten 11 percentage points worse than since the 70s when Lawrence Livermore first started doing this. The reason doesn't get much attention, which is not all paths through the economy are created equal. We've done a lot to actually improve industrial efficiency. We've done a lot to improve residential and commercial efficiency. If you think about air conditioning efficiency, lighting efficiency with LED lights. We're even starting to make a dent in power plant efficiency, particularly here in this state, where renewables are dramatically more productive than the coal plants they're replacing. But the hidden secret, the reason the macroeconomy has gotten worse, is transportation is the least efficient path through the economic system. Only 21% of all the energy that we put into transportation actually goes to moving vehicles around. And I'm going to show you in a few slides, that's an overestimate of the productive use, because most of that goes to moving steel around, not actually cargo, the humans or the load that we're really trying to carry. And what's happened over the 30 years is we've just pumped more and more energy through transportation. So of course the average of the entire economy got worse because we put more, as you can see from the fatness of that bar, through the transportation system. How many of you own a car? Good many of you. I suspect if you arrived here at Park, not by Uber. So I said this was one of the smartest audiences, but I'm about to show you why that was a dumb decision to buy a car. And here's why. How productive do you think your use, your ownership of that car asset is? Pretty bad, right? There's a lot of murmuring here going on. Well, how much of the time are you in your car? You probably heard that statistic. Your car's parked 96% of the time. So you think you bought your car to get around, but you actually bought your car to park it. And most of the time that car is really, really lonely. And the rest of the time that you're in your car, half that time you're really pissed off. Because you're either looking for parking or stuck in congestion. So the actual net productive time in your car is about 2.6%. That's the time you're really moving from A to B, actually going somewhere. Now, it gets worse because we're pumping in fuel into this car. And Amory Lovins did this analysis already in the 1970s. Less than 1% of the energy that you're putting in actually goes to moving you and your goods around. Most of it you can see is right off the bat engine losses, turns into heat. A lot of the rest is idling and things that cost you money, tire wear, brake wear, maintenance expenses. Most of the rest goes into aerodynamic friction, and the last little bit really goes to moving the 1.5 tons of steel around, and only the teeny tiny tail really goes to moving the cargo. So 1% efficiency. But we go from there to roads. We've spent for 5 generations, basically since Eisenhower, 5% of all GDP on infrastructure. That's before Trump even came to office. So we spent a lot of money on infrastructure. It comes in the form of fuel taxes, but a lot of other taxes and a lot of your other government spending actually goes to infrastructure at the city level, at the state level, and at the federal level. We utilize our roads at about 5%, 1/10 of the time of the day. Most roads are only loaded one direction each day. In Silicon Valley, we're a little bit more efficient. We load every road in 2 directions if you've driven up and down 280. So we get a little bit better. But still, fundamentally, we built for the peak capacity, or sort of just below peak capacity. That's why we still have traffic jams. But most of the rest of the time, those roads are not very utilized. In fact, there's a great Berkeley study. If you take out the congestion caused by accidents, where a big rig jackknifes and blocks the road, and you just look at the true congestion, if you moved 1% of the vehicles either in their route or in the timing of when they left, so have them leave earlier, have them leave later, you could resolve almost all of those traffic jams. That tells you it's really just a peak loading phenomenon, similar to the electric grid, where we have basically 45% utilization because we built for the peak summer afternoon if you're in California. So that's 0.5% utilization if you've done that math. And then lastly, we kill 38,000 people every year. If you're between the ages of 25 and 55, which is only a portion of this audience, this is your leading cause of death. Your leading cause of death, more than gunshots, more than any infectious diseases, more than terrorism or any of the other things that get lots of media attention. This is an epidemic. Now, some of you may say, fine, but we have to get around, this is just a fact of life. So let me tell you, in 1956, we had the same per passenger mile fatality rate for air travel as we did for surface travel. How many people die per year in airplanes now? Statistically, just under 200. It obviously comes in lumps because they're big planes, but statistically under 200. We drive more in the meantime than we fly, so you have to multiply that by 4 to adjust to passenger miles. So we kill statistically 800 people a year by plane travel, 38,000 by surface travel. So if you think about that, what change did we make to air travel since 1956? That was the year the 2 planes collided over Long Island and killed everybody and a bunch of people on the ground. We got serious about autopilots, radar, air traffic control, pilot training, and we made sure that we had flight corridors, and we digitized a whole bunch of systems on airplanes. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like autonomous cars a little bit? So that's part of what's coming. So I hope I've convinced you that transportation today sucks. In economic terms, to translate sucks into numbers, of the $3 per mile that we're spending, not counting the social cost of carbon, which would be another $1 here, we waste 99%. It's $1 for your car and car payments and parking expenses and fuel. It's another $1 for the roads that you're paying indirectly as a citizen and taxpayer. And it's a third $1 in other expenses, the consequences, health consequences of air pollution, the injuries, and the time lost from work for all of the accidents that we have and the congestion costs. And again, carbon would come on top as a fourth $1. So while it's necessary and a basic part of our economy, it's not very well optimized today. In fact, you can see there's lots of billion-dollar challenges here. We have security issues, we have a lot of congestion issues I've talked about, we have a lot of damage, and we spend a lot of money on infrastructure that's not at all optimized. So every one of these is actually a billion-dollar problem. What's even more problematic is we spend a lot of money on this through our government, but our planners actually haven't woken up to the fact that there's a sea change already afoot. I'm not talking about the future, I'm talking about things that already show up in government data. These are the government's forecasts from the Department of Transportation of vehicle miles traveled. Since the 1940s, vehicle miles traveled have been linear with GDP growth. Makes sense. More economy, move more goods, move more people, grows. Except for the fact that only government planners think that dynamic continues. You can actually see since 2004, before the recession, I would call that a flat curve. Right? We haven't actually seen the same vehicle mile travel increase, and GDP has grown quite nicely in the last couple of years. So this has changed. Why has it changed? Well, there's a lot of phenomena going on having to do with people moving back to cities. But there's one single device that you all know, that you probably all have in your pocket, that actually triggered a big bunch of these changes. We all used to carry this stuff around with us, and now there's an app for that. Yes, this iPhone is now way old. But what's interesting and doesn't get much attention is the many different ways in which this technology has already disrupted transportation. And obviously there's more to come if you think about it broadly. But think about the destruction of trips. How many of you still go to a bank physically more than once or twice a year? Okay, a few of you. Most of you don't, right? Most of you do your banking online through PayPal, through credit cards. You don't actually have to go to a bank. You don't have to see a teller. Same thing for dating. People used to do drive-thrus to see a movie. Now it's online. How many of you go to a Blockbuster still and go collect a VHS tape and watch that in your VCR? That's all online, right? Netflix is booming, reported great financial results. So that's one. The social dynamics have shifted. Car ownership went from being a status symbol, a rite of passage that you're becoming an adult, to actually being a hassle. I taught graduate students at Stanford. They're all in their early to mid-20s. All of them got given a car by their parents, many of them a nice car, Prius, BMW, you name it. All of them sold their car because it's no longer something that's of value to them. And by the way, a couple of them have a $1,000 a month Uber bill. So it's not as if these people aren't going anywhere, it's just they don't want to do it by car ownership. Of course, we're used to the fact that that app now accesses transportation. Caltrain's a little bit behind, you can't quite book that on an app yet, but your Uber and your taxi and many other things. I was just in Japan last week, and you can book everything on the Pasmo app on your phone, right? You can book your taxi, you can pay at the 7-Eleven, you can get on any subway. It's all very straightforward and easy. And then there's the components. Those phones were the pioneers of the lithium-ion battery technology that has crossed over first into power tools and now in the last couple of years into electric vehicles, right? That's where they came from. That's why they came down the cost curve, because we shipped 700 million phones every year, and that made it a big enough market to invest in. So that's component disruption. What we haven't yet really realized is how much the cameras that are now ubiquitous on all phones are also crossing over into vehicles and changing the way that we do autonomous driving. Camera performance is on an amazing curve. There's a big race going on right now between LiDAR and cameras. Long term, I would bet on cameras, but near term, I would still only get in an autonomous car that has LiDAR in it. So there's a ways to go, but it's definitely improving at a rate that's driven by mobile phones. So think about that. A little innocuous device that we all take for granted in the meantime is actually disrupting a gigantic industry that's 10-15% of most major industrial economies in terms of transportation and vehicles. It's huge. I also said it already shows up demographically. This is the increase in vehicle miles traveled per capita. You can see we're driving longer into old age, which has its own risks, because above 72 you start driving poorly again statistically. But you can see the younger demographic, which is bigger, isn't driving as much. In fact, we've seen a 30% reduction in people getting driver's licenses. If you think about that relative to your childhood, where getting a driver's license was a big deal, now people are saying, I don't need a driver's license. My daughter, who's 10, will probably still get a license because she's interested in cars, but she already takes for granted that she'll have autonomous cars, so she doesn't really need a driver's license. I want to show you just how unusual it was that cars actually dominated for most of our lives. This is data from Australia. I couldn't find similar data going back far enough in the US. But what you see is the modal share of different modes of transit. Obviously, walking dominated in the long distant past. Horses were pretty good. And then we got into all kinds of other new infrastructure, rail, boats. Those were very popular for a long time. But the fact that since the 50s cars have taken over as the dominant form is actually a historical anomaly. Has never been the case before. You can already see in the Australian data, cars are just beginning to decline. This is probably one of the worst geographies in terms of any other kind of new transportation technology, given the distances and the density. If you plotted this in San Francisco, you'd already see a massive change underway. We've seen second and third vehicle ownership drop. We've seen the value of parking spaces and parking garages in San Francisco start to drop. So the sea change is already afoot. Now I want to switch to a forward view. What's going to happen here? First of all, to debunk one thing right away, particularly in a very technologically minded crowd, there is no single silver bullet solution for transportation. I'm not an advocate of Hyperloop's going to solve it all. The autonomous car is going to solve it all. Transportation is a very complex system, and for it to work, needs a lot of interplay of private enterprise, good regulation, government, good policy, and a lot of investments. And it needs to be by distance. So I'll give you my kind of overarching thesis, which is that really what's the optimal form of transportation depends on how far and where you're trying to go. If I want to get from downtown Palo Alto to Stanford, I can walk, I can bike. Right? If I'm going 2 miles or less, walking actually is the most efficient form of transportation. If I'm going vertically, an elevator is the most efficient form of transportation. By the way, little known fact, elevators are by far and away the winner of the most efficient form of transportation on the planet. They're about 99.5% efficient because they're counterweighted, have regenerative braking, and they're all electric. Zero waste. Amazing form of transportation, 100 years old. So, near in, elevators are walking. As you get further, biking and mobility as a service, particularly in the moderate, lower density suburban neighborhoods. And then for long distance, I'm out to convince you that actually public transit still wins because of the carrying capacity on a lane of travel. If you have a good rail system, Caltrain or BART are actually reasonable, not great relative to global standards, but I'll show you some economic data in a little bit. That's a better way to get from here to San Francisco than driving your own car, even than riding your own autonomous car. So take that as the kind of macro picture. Now let's zoom in a little bit. What drives transportation? Well, it's been known for a long time that land use plays a big role. Which of these two corporate campuses has 70% more office space? Cisco or Salesforce? Anybody want to venture a guess? Well, it's a transportation talk, so it's the right-hand side. So what an efficient way. Think about that footprint. Think about the connectivity. It's a block from a bus terminal. It's a block and a half from a BART station. You can get anywhere in the Bay Area connected from that nodal tower. And of course, most of the office space is again connected by elevators. So talk about an efficient way to get from one office to another. What's the left one? Well, it's mostly parking lot. Right? It's actually not mostly building, it's mostly parking lot. So that's an age-old axiom. Obviously that still matters because how we build our infrastructure environment still drives this. We can change this, and by the way, I picked an extreme example here. People usually say, well, but we're mostly suburban and we like it that way, right? Well, economically, if you look at what it takes, the density it takes to get public transit to work, actually almost all of our cities in the South Bay here are above that threshold. Los Altos Hills isn't, but even cities like Cupertino, which are pretty sparse, are above the threshold. They're not any less dense than Portland, and Portland actually has a great transit system. If you look at cities like Palo Alto and Mountain View, we're actually way above the density levels required to make good public transit work. And I want to show you just some visual examples. These are some places in the same kind of climate that we are. What have they done? They have walking downtown cores, and then they have transit systems going beyond. Most of you have probably been to Venice, Florence, or some of these Italian cities. They have roughly double the height limit that we have in our municipalities. Instead of 2 or 3 stories like most of our towns, they've gone to 5 or 6. That turns out to be just that critical threshold. So you don't need to build Salesforce towers and high rises. We just need to go a little bit higher and actually get better shade from the sunshine in the peak of summer. And you can have wonderful urban experiences. I'll show you the conversion that's happened. Most of you probably recognize this place. When I first visited it, the reason I have no accent in English is because I spent a year in Leavenworth, Kansas at the military base, not the prison. And this was New York at that time in the 80s. Terrible place. Lots of places you wouldn't want to take your kids to at that time at Times Square. It cleaned up a little bit in the 90s, and look at where it is today. It's an amazing place to visit. It's one of the top tourist destinations, incredible number of visitors. All of these merchants are doing better than they ever have. And it's a great place to hang out because it has the density that foot traffic suddenly works. Here's a statistic that you've probably never heard. When Mayor Bloomberg closed off the avenues and only allowed crosstown traffic, what do you think happened to throughput for cars in Times Square? Most people think, oh, we gave up car throughput for pedestrian access. No, throughput for cars went up 20%. And if you've ever been in New York, crosstown traffic is the problem, not actually north-south traffic. It's the crosstown traffic that's really painful. Makes sense. Nobody's turning anymore. You know exactly how to route efficiently if it's organized like this. We have some of these neighborhoods here. This is Santana Row. And we can build more. As we built more, we've had the wrong policy on a number of dimensions. We've incentivized all our transit to get area coverage, and when we've thought about urban planning, we've tried to locate our housing near our public transit. That's completely backwards, because if you think about your car, if your work is not near transit, you need your car at the other end of that transit, right, to get from transit to your workplace. Guess what? That leaves your car stranded at work most days, and you don't have your car for all the other trips that all originate around your house. So this data clearly shows that if you have to make a choice between workplace or home near transit, you actually want your workplace to be near transit because it generates more ridership. Obviously, ideal is to have both near transit. And then you can actually see, and we see this delta between, we have the perfect two examples here, San Jose with 2.5%, 3% transit ridership, and San Francisco with 40% transit ridership in the same geography, in the same kind of environment. Cities roughly the same age, but obviously different land use footprint. We also, for political reasons, we build weird infrastructure. I was just in Tokyo. I took a monorail directly from downtown, directly into the terminal of Haneda Airport, and flew out internationally from there. If you look at these examples, Hong Kong, Zurich. Zurich's my favorite airport in the world. It's an elevator ride from your plane to your train, and then you can go anywhere in Switzerland. Amazing. Why don't we do that? You can see in our case, not only have we made it more expensive than these other locations, but in every case, the car is faster in the US. Whereas in all these other countries, in every case, transit is faster. And why is that? Well, because there are no nonstops. Any of you have ever tried to take public transit to Palo Alto from SFO? Has anybody done that? Okay, there's 2, 3 hands up. I did it. The only people I ran into were Japanese tourists who got suckered into taking transit because you have to go northbound. Well, you have to take AirTrain. Then you have to go northbound on BART to then go southbound on Caltrain. How does that make any sense? Yeah. And by the way, you have to buy different tickets with different passes. And the train schedules aren't coordinated, so you're waiting. Yeah. I want to show you a more general point, which is about the neglected dimension. As I said, we built transit by area coverage. That means policymakers are saying, what percentage of the population is near a transportation stop? Think about that. When you make a decision about whether to get somewhere, do you ask the question, how close am I to a transportation stop? No, you say, how long does it take me to get there? Well, that depends on the speed and the frequency of that vehicle, right? How long do I have to wait for something to show up? So we count people as being served by transit if once a day a bus goes by a stop near them. I don't call that served by transit, right? So we've designed this massive area coverage with very, very low frequency, with really poor service, and we invest a lot more in the roads and the infrastructure and the rails than we do actually in the vehicles. This data basically shows you that the number one driver of ridership is how often the vehicles come. You see cities there on the right-hand side, New York City, Vienna, that have a vehicle every 2 or 3 minutes. How many of you gone to New York and checked the schedule before you got on the subway? Yeah, you laugh because it's silly, right? You go downstairs and the train will come in 3 or 4 minutes, so you just get on. If you go to Tokyo and you want to go to Osaka, the Shinkansen that goes high-speed rail from Tokyo to Osaka leaves at rush hour every 3 minutes, at off-peak every 7 minutes. Think about that. It's here to LA every 3 minutes. we wouldn't fly, right? You'd just show up and you'd get on. I want to show you a couple examples. And by the way, most of our cities are in that upper left quadrant there that's expanded. You'd be hard-pressed in most cities in America. I've picked the busiest route in these number periods here. But in most cities, the busiest route is somewhere between every 20 minutes and every 40 minutes. And obviously, that's the most frequent route. There's a lot that are more rare than that. Here's some train schedules. This is the Caltrain schedule, the one that's 2 minutes faster than today. Here's the Shinkansen, and you can see how often that runs. And here's my favorite of all time. This is my original hometown, Vienna. Weird train schedule, right? Why? Well, because between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m., they don't bother to put the time. Why? Because it's every 2 to 5 minutes. So who cares? That's my timetable, right? I show up and I get on. I want to show you the other effect of the area metric. Here is our local bus transit system, VTA. I've plotted the bus routes aligned by the ridership on a weekly basis, average weekday boardings. And you can see there's some bus lines over there on the right-hand side that have, just a couple riders a day. Again, if there's only a couple buses a day, not surprising, has a couple riders a day. There's some routes over here, mostly on El Camino, connecting downtown cores that are actually great bus routes. But what if we didn't try to spread them all peanut butter everywhere? What if we actually said, okay, let's run buses where we have the ridership, and let's do the rest with ride sharing. Do the rest with Uber. And okay, this is mostly a transportation system for the less well-off right now, right? Bus ridership versus Caltrain ridership. Bus ridership is an average income of $25,000 household income. Caltrain is $125,000. More people skateboard, bike, or walk to Caltrain than cross from a bus to Caltrain. Think about that. More people skateboard to Caltrain than cross from a bus to Caltrain, because demographically, those are different universes. A bunch of you have probably taken Caltrain. Not many of you would ride the bus, I'm willing to bet. So let's take those bus routes, knock them off. Let's spend that money instead on subsidizing Uber rides. Here's the break-even point. The lower line is if I'm willing to pay for an individual Uber ride, right? So your regular Uber X. The upper line is Uber Pool. And it shows you just how many of those bus lines are actually in the money if I instead paid for everybody that rode the bus to just take an Uber. I could get rid of all of the costs of running the system, or even better, I could take all those buses and all those drivers and redeploy them into some of these routes here in the middle that actually would be even better if they had 5-minute service as opposed to 20-minute service intervals. So remember how I said at the beginning, there's no silver bullet. If I have a high demand route, I'm better off running a train or a bus. If I have a low demand route, I'm much better running an autonomous vehicle or a shared vehicle. And that gets me right into the economics. The broad perception in America is, well, mass transit is a form of public welfare. Well, these are the different fare box recovery rates. How much money do we spend as taxpayers, as government, to subsidize different kinds of public transportation? You can see here we've got two systems, BART and Caltrain, that are not bad, sort of 70, 80% fare box recovery. They mostly pay for themselves. We've got some bus systems on the right-hand side that really are heavily subsidized that don't work. They have very low ridership. They have too much. They're too spread out. VTA, by the way, is working very hard to do what I just described on the previous page. So to give them credit, they've realized this. They're working on changing the network in the right direction. I put these on just to show that these can actually be profitable businesses. Above 100% fare box recovery means that system's making profit. Taipei, London, Hong Kong, all profitable transit systems. But the real question is, okay, the alternative is taking a car. What's the fare box recovery rate, virtually speaking, of car travel? Anybody ever asked that question? Turns out it's about 44 cents on the dollar. If you count all of the subsidy for our freeway network, for our roads, and factored that in and said, what portion of the full cost are we really paying for? It's in that neighborhood. The rest is all from general funds. This includes, by the way, all of the gas taxes that really come from drivers, right? So on top of the gas taxes, we subsidize. our highway. So if you look where that line goes, yes, VTA is less efficient than car travel, so we're kind of subsidizing. But if you look at BART and Caltrain, actually per passenger mile, per passenger that we deliver, it's a more efficient way to get around. Not surprising because that's a very high frequency corridor with a lot of demand, and we all know what it feels like to be stuck on 101 in traffic jams. It's not a great way to get around. Broaden that a little bit, and here's another mode that doesn't get enough attention. This is a nice little picture way of showing just how many more people you can fit into a road if they bicycle or if they take a bus, rather than if they all drive their individual car. The right-hand side is a fun picture of, and this is admittedly an extreme, just how many bicycles you can park in one vehicle parking spot. You have to be Dutch to do it that way, but here's an experiment we did at Stanford. We took mid-range commuters, people that worked at Stanford or work at Stanford, and commuted in for more than 2 miles. Because under 2 miles, Stanford has already been successful for 15 years at getting those people to bike or to walk. And again, under 2 miles, that's the best form of transportation. So we looked at 3 to kind of 6, 7 miles out. And we looked at, can we get them to change modes? All of these people drove at the start of the study. And what's interesting here is you look at car travel, you know, our general conception is it's fast, right? I can go 10 miles in about 12, 13 minutes. But of course, that's the car commercial world. There's nobody else on the road. There's beautiful trees, you know, it's sunshine. That's not our experience, right? Here's our actual data for the Bay Area. Here's your car in traffic with having to find a parking space at the end. Here's the traditional bike, and here is the e-bike. And what you can see, up until about 7, 8 miles out, the bike's actually neck to neck with the car under the real traffic environment. So we got a third of all of these employees to permanently shift to electric scooters and electric bikes because it was far healthier, it was less stressful, they didn't have to find or pay for parking, and they wound up ahead. And you can actually see for the first 3.5, 4 miles, you're faster on a bike than you are in a car. So, particularly here in California, maybe not these last couple weeks with all the rain we've had, but it's a great way to get around. Certainly possible like Copenhagen or Netherlands. Now let's talk about the economics. We built what I call the California WIMP model, which assumed that every single trip where you were either carrying something or it was raining or otherwise any kind of nasty cold weather, that you took an Uber. The rest of the time you biked. You can see that relative to car ownership at a little over $7,000 a year, again, not counting the road costs, just counting the direct ownership costs, you still come out ahead actually taking a bike and Uber in combination. And of course, we need to upgrade the infrastructure. We do a lot of feel good here in California, painting bike lanes, which statistically actually is more dangerous than not having bike lanes. Why? Because the bikers get complacent. They think, oh, now I'm safe. But you're not actually safe unless you have the middle or the right-hand side. The right-hand side is your typical Dutch or Danish infrastructure where you separate. By the way, grade separation and dedicated lanes for one type of traffic, one type of vehicles, that sound familiar? It's the Eisenhower freeway system, right? Why did car travel get better in the 50s? Because we built dedicated lanes for people who were going one particular route. That's all that a superhighway network of bike lanes would be as well. So let's come back to autonomy and the technology disruptions. I started with this picture. Transportation sucks, to recap. Now, how can we make it better? Well, we have a lot of companies already making it better, right? Google's working on autonomy, as a whole bunch of other companies. We've got 21 car companies now working on autonomy here in the Bay Area. We've got a lot of people trying to make connectivity, data services, Waze, Apple and Google Maps. We have Tesla and a whole bunch of small companies now going electric. And actually, big car companies have woken up. We're going to have somewhere around 30 to 40 options for electric car models. GM came out with the Bolt that has the same range as a Tesla at about half the price. I've driven in that car. It's actually a very nice car. And of course, we have car sharing. These are all a big deal economically. Why? Because I can reduce 90% of the accidents, the 38,000 deaths, and the $300 billion in economic damage from congestion and waiting. I can integrate different kinds of transit by having it all be on one app and by coordinating traffic. I can make my powertrain go from that 1% efficient to somewhere between 50 and 80% efficient, maybe 85 in the extreme case. And I go from 2.6% utilization to pretty easily above 50. If that vehicle does deliveries in its off hours and I put it to other uses as well, I might get as high as 70. Nobody will really want the 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. time slot. So that's still a good time to recharge or do maintenance or something else. But again, we can get very high utilization on these vehicles. You have to remember that at peak rush hour today in America, 15%, 15% of the vehicles are on the road. I know it doesn't feel like that. It feels like they're all on the road, but only 15% are on the road at rush hour. So 85% are parked even at peak utilization. Let me talk about the different components. First of all, electric. This is a view from what I would not call an advocate of electric transportation. This is ExxonMobil's forecast. And what's fascinating to me about this forecast is they've done this for 25 years along with Shell scenario planning. And they've always said the world needs more oil, the world will have more cars, we're going to go from 1 billion cars to 2 billion. There is no substitute for oil, so live with it. But in the last scenario forecast, suddenly they said, hey, there's these battery cars coming in 2040. I said, wow, how fascinating. What changed your mind? I went to the scenario planning team, and sure enough, what they said was, that's when batteries are going to be $200 per kilowatt hour, and that's when electric cars are more economic than gasoline cars, so people will start buying them. By the way, I agree with that assumption with one little difference. They're off by 2 decades in when we hit $200 per kilowatt hour, because basically we're going to have that in 2 or 3 years. We're at about 300, 350, depending on which manufacturer you look at today. So total cost of ownership-wise, electric cars are in the money today. The upfront cost is still higher because we have to buy a big, expensive battery pack. So the upfront cost will get equivalent when you get to 2020. But by the way, put that same electric car into sharing, and you don't care about the upfront cost, right? You just care about the per mile cost, and we're already in the money today. So that's electric cars. Now let's talk about autonomy. Why would we care about autonomy and AI in driving? A couple of you wrote in questions and asked questions along this lines. Well, I've talked about one, which is handling traffic jams. Driving in traffic jams is pretty boring, pretty stressful, so we want to get rid of that. Today, 68% of all accidents are caused by one simple thing. The human driver didn't pay attention. Distraction is the #1 cause of accidents. 2/3 of all accidents are caused by that. If I had a technology that has 360 awareness, never goes to sleep, never gets bored, never thinks about their mother, never thinks about what they forgot to do, that's a good technology for driving, right? We have a whole bunch of parts of the population that can't drive today for legal or physical ability reasons. A lot of accidents can be avoided if you have faster reaction times. I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. So safety is another huge benefit here. And the most important economic effect is asset productivity. If my car is autonomous, I don't have to park it when I'm not using it. It can go on to do the next ride. So that's a huge opportunity. It's already here today. These are all trucks. The left one is Scania, the right one is Mitsubishi, the top right is Peloton, that are all driving, coordinating, communicating with each other. That's one step towards full autonomy. These are still human-driven in the lead vehicle. But the following vehicle can more or less follow automatically. I want to show you actually an MIT study. This is kind of fun. What happens to intersections when we have autonomy? Well, today we don't actually need the audio. Today, you see cars queuing up there at an intersection. We've all had that experience, right? You wait for your turn. You can wait 2 or 3 traffic light phases sometimes to make the turn. Here's autonomous intersections. A little scary if you're sitting in that car. But if you look at the throughput, you look at the emissions, you look at the speed of getting through that intersection, all dramatically better. Yeah, you don't want to be the first one, particularly you don't want to be in that intersection if there's still humans driving around. That's very scary. But that's the potential. I see this as much more the long-term potential. This is kind of a 30 years out view, because in the meantime, we still need traffic lights. There'll still be a bunch of humans on the road, so we can't really drive this way. And all of us will have to get used to this. Our children will play video games that will prepare them for this scenario. So, but why will we get there? Well, the big sea change is we've got over a dozen multi-billion-dollar corporations investing to make this happen. All of these companies initially sort of laughed at Google and said, yeah, one day there'll be autonomy. In the last 24 months, they've all put in place multi-billion-dollar programs to develop autonomous vehicles. Originally, the timelines were all sort of 2030-ish. Most of them have moved to 2020 or 2021 now. You ask for my personal opinion, they'll be a year or two late, just like Tesla is on pretty much every car. But we're not far off. This is not like end of our lifetime. This is in the next 4 or 5 years. Now, particularly here in California, we're going to be early adopters, so we'll see a lot of this early. It will take 20, 25 years for it to spread everywhere in the world. Yes, the farmer that lives 20 miles from his nearest neighbor, by the way, is driving an autonomous tractor today. I don't know how many of you know that. But they probably won't sell their pickup truck that they use to get around on the roads for a little while. So it won't happen evenly. Singapore will be ahead. California will be relatively early. But actually, Michigan, of all places, is moving faster than California right now. We have a lot of these vehicles around already. This is my ride in the Google car. But really important is to understand autonomy by itself, as I said at the beginning, is not a panacea. Because picture autonomy where you still own the car. So you commute to San Francisco, and then you send your autonomous car back because it's cheaper to go back than it is to park in the city for $35 a day. So now you're on the highway, and the car to your right is driving empty because it just picked up somebody's tie from the dry cleaner. The car to your left is returning. Some rich kid, got dropped off at a private school, and the car's going back home empty. And the car ahead of you is somebody who doesn't want to pay for San Francisco parking. So now you're on the highway surrounded by a sea of empty cars, but you're still stuck in congestion. We haven't really made it better. Today we have 1.2 people per car. Autonomy by itself could mean that we are stuck in congestion with less than one person per car on the highway. And they still have all 5 seats, so. Yeah. So why do I say we need sharing? We need sharing because we got to put more bodies into the same vehicles. Uber Pool, Lyft Line, great idea. We have this idea for a long time. Here's actually the carrying capacity in terms of people per lane per hour of different modes of transit. So today, in a regular car, on a surface street, it's about 1,300 vehicles per lane per hour. On a good highway, you can cram in about 2,000 people per lane per hour. That's like your best highway density. You cram any more in that, and you get congestion and a traffic jam, throughput drops. You cram any more in that, and you start getting Beijing parking lots on the highways. So that's our peak limit today. With autonomy, yes, we can change the spacing. We don't need 8 car lengths. We can go to 1 or 2 meters between cars, yard and a half. We can go to 8,000 vehicles and people per lane per hour. But if we don't put more bodies in, we can't get to these kind of numbers. Look at the rail line, 32,000. By the way, this is a US estimate. If you go to Europe, they would tell you it's between 45 and 60,000 people per lane per hour for a good rail system. The Shinkansen is 16 train cars long, crossing Japan in 2.5 hours. And they're now working on one that goes to the mountains that will be actually half the time of the current one. So here we go. That's why we need to share. We can share physical land footprint vertically in the same building, the elevators. We can share the vehicles. We can share the parking spaces, make our real estate use more efficient. And of course, we can share in bigger vehicles. Carpooling by itself, by the way, has never worked in the US except for 2 exceptions. One of them was World War II when we rationed gasoline, and everybody thought it was patriotic. And the other one is 3 or more passengers carpool lanes with bridges or tunnels, like the Bay Bridge, certain crossings in Virginia where people slug and actually get on with random strangers. And carpooling works in those real choke points. The rest of the time, we haven't been willing to carpool. Why? Because carpooling has been thought of the same people taking the same route at the same time every day. I don't know about you, but I don't do that. I go at a different time every day, and I don't have the same route every day. So until we make this dynamic through an app, it's not really going to work. That's why ride sharing is fundamentally different from carpooling, because it's not fixed. It's not fixed inventory and it's not fixed routes. So let me talk about the economics of ride sharing. A little bit of a complicated chart. You've got population down at the bottom sorted by how many miles they drive per year. The far right hand is the traveling salesman who's driving 16,000 miles per year or more. Over here are most of us who are doing short commutes in the suburbs. The average for the US is about 10, 11,000 miles, depends on the region you look at. Here you've got purchasing or leasing a car. Per mile it's then less, but you've got a big upfront payment. Transit's cheap, but not everywhere equally available, and not the right frequency. Here are new models. You want to have your own vehicle, UberX. Yeah, you pay more per mile, that's why the slope is steeper. But you pay very little up front. You basically pay that security fee every time you go in, right? Look at the crossover point. It's about 5,000 miles. If I'm willing to share that ride, that crossover point's about 10,000 miles. So now I've covered half the population of the US. So for that half, economically, they don't have a reason to own a car anymore. They'd be better off just sharing the whole time, getting rid of your car. We see that already. People are deferring new car purchases. People are getting rid of second and third cars. So far, most people aren't willing to give up their first car yet, but I think that will come soon as well. By the way, this is today's sharing. 60% of that cost is the human driver taking you around. I make that car autonomous, I roughly double these crossover points. So now I'm at 20,000 miles per year that's in the money for car sharing and ride sharing. That's almost everybody in the US. Again, a few places where people drive enough miles that doesn't work. What I'm really excited about, this is what Doug mentioned of kind of how does this vision really develop, is that these aren't independent phenomena. Not only are they each better than what we have today, but they reinforce each other positively. So if I think about sharing and autonomy, the autonomous car initially is going to be very expensive, $200,000, $300,000 per car. Very few of us are really going to buy one of those cars. A few will. Most of us are going to get to know it through shared vehicles. And in the shared usage, amortized over a couple 100,000 miles over the next couple of years, it makes total economic sense to have that car be autonomous, to not pay for the driver, and to have it be able to run nearly 24/7 in constant use. So those two are clearly better. If I think about sharing an electric, I already mentioned the fact that if you share, I don't have to pay that big, heavy upfront cost for the battery. I just pay the per mile cost. That's better today. I don't have to wait for 2020 better batteries, right? So suddenly that's, and then I mentioned this already, but autonomous and talking to each other, I get an 8x increase because I shrink the space between the cars. The autonomous cars can all coordinate. Now that will first come in the form of carpool lanes converting to autonomous only lanes, because you can't have human-driven cars in the middle of that. Otherwise you get a weird sandwich. But think about that. We're about to embark on a national program of spending billions of dollars to upgrade our road system. Now if that's fixing bridges, great. But if that's building more lanes, when in 4 years or so, we can have autonomous lanes that have 8 times the capacity in the current lane. 101 or 280 goes from 4 lanes to a virtual 32 lanes. That's a massive waste. So we shouldn't be building more roads at the same scale that we have been, given that vehicle miles traveled is flat and we're about to get more density out of this. I call that whole concept ACES. Autonomous, connected, electrified, and shared. Obviously, for any of you playing poker, that's the analogy here of this is really the ACE. Daimler has adopted this now and calls it CASE. Same acronym with just a different sorting of the letters. But really important to remember is it has to come together, which actually takes some policy intervention. Because if I do all of this, I get, instead of about $3 per mile, I get down to about 8 cents a mile. And remember, I can buy a trip on a variable basis. About half of unemployment in the US today is structural unemployment because people can't get from where they live to where jobs are. Half of unemployment. Everybody can afford to get to work at 8 cents a mile because I could just pay a little portion of what I make during that day. And if you want to see how bad transit deserts are, just go to East Palo Alto from here. There's very little public transportation that goes through there, so you have to own a car. That's why you see so many cars parked in East Palo Alto. Important, as I already mentioned, is how we deploy autonomy, though. If we deploy it by itself as a luxury feature of cars that are still individually owned, I get that congestion from the car carrying the tie and the car carrying the bottle of milk and the car running home empty. If I deploy it in ACES, I start actually getting the safety benefit, the efficiency benefit. Now, there is some debate here still. Over the last 6 months, most of the automakers have come around to the view that actually sharing and autonomy go together, because they finally did the economics and said, wow, these cars are going to be really expensive. And by the way, I can make more money running them per mile and selling them per mile than I can do selling you a car. If you're buying a mid-sized car, a regular mid-American car, the car manufacturer makes about $800 to $1,000 in profit. If I put that same car into a ride-sharing service, I can make about $40 per month. Doesn't take much math to figure out which one makes more money over time. What's less clear, and this is where the regulatory intervention comes in, is today there's not yet a natural synergy between electrification and autonomy. There is if you wind up doing sharing as well, because sharing and electrification have a mutual benefit. But so far, a lot of the autonomous car programs are still being done with non-electric vehicles, even though you get this additional benefit of the efficiency, the ability to speed up, the ability to drive with no pollution and no fuel use in inner cities. But if we go this route, it will dramatically change everything we know about our landscape. 25% of all urban land is devoted to parking. Think about 25% of Manhattan, 25% of Tokyo, 25% of San Francisco suddenly being available for redevelopment. That's the first time we have that opportunity in 150 years. There's an estimate that the total land area in San Francisco that's coming free is equivalent to another Golden Gate Park. Think about what that means in terms of civic potential, extra housing, whatever we want to do with it. Now, a lot of you are questioning, okay, but what about rebound? Right? When a technology makes something cheaper, we consume more of it. When gas prices go down, we drive more. All of us consume about 2 orders of magnitude more light than our great-great-grandparents did when light was really expensive. So we've increased a dramatic amount. Economically, we still spend much less on light than we used to, and actually we still consume less fuel and less energy on light. Autonomy has that potential. People can move to the suburbs, move into the woods, and say, I'm going to do email on my way in. I don't care that I have a 2-hour commute because now that's productive time, right? So that potential exists. Again, this is where the policy environment comes in. Autonomy deployed by itself can lead to massive sprawl because people move further out and they don't care, particularly if you have the means to afford an expensive autonomous car. We need to move from a gasoline tax basis to some kind of regulatory structure that really incents people to share and that also charges us for the infrastructure use that we consume, right? How efficient are we at the infrastructure? You can do that through congestion charging, you can do it in a mileage tax. You can just have different incentives. Our single biggest incentive for EVs was the fact that we gave people carpool lane access even if you're a single driver in an electric vehicle. So there's lots of tools to do it. It doesn't have to be one particular political philosophy of how you structure the intervention. But there's huge potential here actually to make all of our communities and all of our cities much more efficient, much more livable, much safer. There are some unanswered questions still. How do we change insurance? Today it's all bound to drivers, right? Each of you has to get insurance. I have to get insurance as a driver. In the future, is that per trip? Is that per mile? Is that by the system operator? Or do you go the route of Volvo who said, hey, we as the manufacturer take full responsibility when you're driving autonomously. Insurance comes included. Lot of debates about these kind of corner cases. The trolley problem of you have the grandma or you have the baby carriage, which one do you kill? I want to be really clear that I think that's a huge distraction to the public policy debate because we're talking about the little 1% corner of the cases, right? Remember, we're killing 40,000 people per year, increasingly so because of more cell phones and Pokemon now. And we could be saving most of those by deploying autonomy quickly and deploying it in particular areas quickly where we have highly specific maps and limited speeds, so kind of shuttle service, a campus service. So yes, we need to think about, do I protect the occupant and the pedestrian? But first of all, we need to say most of these cases, the 2/3 that are caused by driver inattention, let's get rid of those. Let's solve those today. I already mentioned the taxes. And then the last one, how do we actually decide what's good enough? If an autonomous car is as good as an average human driver, would you get into it? So 2/3 of Americans today say no. My experience, having watched lots of people interact with autonomous cars for the first time, is it takes about 20 minutes riding in one before the answer changes to yes. If you get experience through a shared car, you actually will all come to yes. But you will actually trust that autonomous car too much, and you'll start watching Harry Potter while you're riding autonomously. So I would agree with the person who said no. It needs to be substantially better than the average human driver. 10x better, 100x better? Well, let me show you some data on humans. This is the work that we're doing at Notto, trying to understand human driving as a basis for doing great autonomous driving. There's enough people in this room that we probably represent this curve more or less, maybe not the very tail ends. 20% of us will throughout our entire life never cause an accident. We might get rear-ended, we might get hit while our car's parked, we might have a tree fall on our car while it's in our driveway, but we won't cause an accident. Most of us are in this middle camp where we'll drive well most of the time, but when we're playing Pokemon or using our phone or texting or turning around to deal with the kid in the back seat, we will cause accidents. And then 15% of us cause 85% of all accidents. The last guy, and it is a man on that spectrum, has 14 accidents every year. There's a big debate about do women or men drive better. It turns out it depends on the country, even depends on the city. It's fascinating to study this kind of data. In California, women have more accidents, but men cause far more damage. It's all those shopping cart accidents and backing into the parking lot. So if you're causing 15 accidents a year, 14 accidents a year, usually the reaction is, well, why are they driving? They should just take Uber all the time. And I agree, right? They take transit, take Uber. What's fascinating is if you're thinking about autonomous cars, most autonomous car efforts today try to basically follow the law. They take the DMV rules and they implement that in a vehicle. And then they say, let's play it safe. So what you see in the Google cars that you've all seen if you drive around here is they wait a long time at intersections. They wait for the traffic to clear. They get rear-ended because every time the light changes, they stop, to the great surprise of the guy behind. Right? So we drive conservatively. It makes sense as a manufacturer. Scale that up to an entire city. If you put thousands of those kinds of autonomous cars into San Francisco, you'd basically seize up traffic. Right? What do these people do? Well, they deviate from the law in very predictable, very smart ways. If there's a biker, they'll detour around it. They might cross a double yellow line. They might slow down because they see something 3 cars ahead that they know is going to cause the car ahead of them to slow down. How do we build in those kinds of capabilities? If you think about an intersection, it's not a physics problem, right? Normally, autonomous cars are built with physics problems in mind. How do I not leave my lane, and how do I not hit the car ahead of me? Okay, that's sort of the basic version of driving, right? But if that's all you taught your kid, you'd still be worried about what they're doing on the road. So what do real drivers do? They communicate. They yield. They inch forward to indicate that they're taking their turn, but do it slowly so the other drivers all notice, okay, they're taking their turn, I'm going to stop. I talked about distraction. We have 300,000 miles of data right now. We have 300,000 distraction events. Not good news. Think about that, 1 per mile. The good news is, most of the time when a driver's distracted and makes a major mistake, runs a red light, runs a stop sign, gets too close to another vehicle, you know what happens? The other driver corrects for their mistake. So where we see near misses is single distraction. Where we see accidents is double distraction. If both of you are playing Pokemon, really bad news. So what we want to do is build autonomous cars that drive like this and that know there's idiots out there like this, and they correct for those mistakes, right? Pretty simple. You haven't heard any other manufacturer talk about that's what they're doing for autonomy. So why are we in this business? Because we want to collect data from real drivers. So we're retrofitting a simple telematics device with AI on board with computer vision that tracks the driving behavior of a lot of commercial vehicles. Commercial vehicles because they drive professionally, they drive a lot, and safety is really valuable to them. They get blamed a lot. If you drive a taxi and you hit somebody, and your taxi's damaged, guess what? You don't have a job for the next couple days while your car's being repaired, right? So very high value. We use that to draw data and to figure out who's in that 20% that's good and what are all the crazy things that happen, not necessarily by these commercial drivers, but anybody that the system can see on the road. And we then abstract that, analyze it for the 3D data, we reconstruct that, and we work with 5 automakers on actually building autonomous vehicles for that 5-year out time frame that know all about what good human and bad human driving looks like. I'm going to show you one little video example just of what the system sees. This is not what we show the driver, obviously. Showing your real motion video while you're driving is not a good idea either. Right up there with Pokemon. But you can see from just a monocular visual system, a single camera, we can tell the vehicles, classify them, the distance, their speed, whether they're parked, whether they're moving. You can notice they turn red when you get close to them. Tell that's a police car. We see the stop sign. So this is game changing. Remember I said the camera technology from the mobile phones crossing into vehicles. Suddenly the vehicles can be intelligent because they can see. For 15 years we've tracked with a OBD device, onboard diagnostic, or a accelerometer or a GPS, where's the vehicle? But if you've ever tried to teach a kid to drive by watching acceleration, braking, it doesn't work, right? I need to see what are they seeing, what are they paying attention to. So I need that context. Because by the way, if I don't brake and there's a stop sign or a red light, yes, there's no braking event, so historically your usage-based insurance wouldn't have dinged you for that, but it's a really bad thing if I run a red light. If somebody pulls out in a parking space right in front of me, kid jumps out, I'm going to have a really hard braking event, but I just saved somebody's life. So visually, that's a totally different event. We can rate that positively. And we can build up a high-resolution map from the visual data only that's much more accurate than GPS alone, which just gives you the neighborhood. In big cities, GPS can be off by an entire block or two. And of course, the inside. This is a learning system. We want to learn the situation, what the driver did or didn't do, and then what resulted. And remember, 68% of all accidents are caused by distraction. Here's one kind of distraction. This is a neural network watching the driver in real time, detecting when the driver's looking down. So one of the most common forms of distraction. So every time he looks down, you'll see it flags he's distracted. We can measure it, quantify it. We can use it in the driver score. We can use it for feedback. And of course, we can use it for real-time warning. We can even make it context sensitive. If I'm on an open country road, okay to be distracted for a second or two. If there's a car ahead of me braking, probably not. If there's a crosswalk ahead of me or a red light, definitely don't want to be in this situation. By the way, we have lots of drivers that have their eyes closed or are distracted for 8 or 9 seconds. Yeah, think about that at 65 miles per hour, how far you've gone down the road. Yeah, bad news. So, to wrap up, we want to drive transportation productivity. That's really the main theme of tonight. Lots of levers of productivity. We can improve the network. We can make the network multimodal. We can make transportation a lot more convenient by thinking about the user and by making it on demand and by sharing the data and making that all an app integrated. We can share. And remember, my sharing is broader. It's not just about sharing cars. It's about sharing parking spaces, about sharing buildings, about sharing office space, about sharing public transit vehicles, and about sharing land uses vertically. Elevators, parking garages underneath, all of that actually reduces the footprint and makes the system more efficient. Frequency, the big neglected dimension for transportation in America. We need much more frequency for people to really find convenience in transportation, and lots of ways to innovate in new business models. So with that, happy to take questions. We're hiring. If any of this is interesting to you and you'd like to join some of this adventure, please let me know.
Great.
Do you know where the water is?
Oh, the water, yes, right here.
Okay.
And here's your,
Yeah.
wait a minute, you don't need this light.
I don't need it.
Right, okay. All right, hold on, I'll leave. Maybe they're just taking a break. Now, wait a second. So here's how we're going to do the Q&A, all right? We always let you ask questions online when you register, so we're going to pick a few of those and start off with that, and then we're going to go to the audience. We have 2 roving microphones on both aisles here, and I'm going to go back and forth. Then Dr. Heck here is going to answer any and all questions that you have for about the next 15 to 20 minutes, I think. And then we're going to break, let everybody go that wants to go. And will you stay a little longer?
I can stay a little longer, yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is more of a recap than anything else, but so what is the key value proposition of autonomous vehicles? Is it safety, convenience, reclaiming driving time, green cities, helping disabled people, et cetera, et cetera?
All of the above. Answer D, or whatever that is.
So it's going to be a really wonderful thing, right?
Well,
It's just-
if we combine it with sharing and electrification and
Right.
communicating vehicles.
Yeah, I think that was one of the key points that
Yeah.
really should leave here with, is the sharing and autonomy really go hand in hand. They're very complementary. Because otherwise you end up with that driverless nightmare that he showed in that one slide. Okay, let's see, what is the role of communications technology? Like vehicle to city infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to OEM cloud in autonomous driving?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that vehicle to cloud and vehicle to vehicle is very important. You can't get that intersection behavior from the MIT study without the cars communicating with each other. You can't get optimal traffic behavior without reporting everything into a cloud. That's basically what Waze and Google Maps and Apple Maps is doing. I'm a big skeptic about vehicle to infrastructure. It's taken us, remember, 5 generations, 5% of GDP to build our infrastructure. For all of the country to upgrade all of the infrastructure, every traffic light, every stop sign to be smart, every intersection to be smart, isn't going to happen. And in particular, it's under local control. How many different types of traffic lights do you think there are in the US? Different SKUs, different model traffic lights. 32,000. So there's no reason for us to have 32,000 different kinds of traffic lights other than every city wants its own unique design. But you can imagine the problem of trying to make the infrastructure smart. So I don't think the infrastructure is going to get very smart. I think we're going to make the cars get smart and the cloud get smart to deal with the infrastructure that is today. Now, there will be a few cities, brand new cities in China. Singapore will definitely upgrade all its infrastructure. So we'll see some of those. But I think we can get most of the benefits without having to rebuild our entire infrastructure. By the way, the single biggest thing we could do to make autonomous cars easier is just get really good at painting lanes, which is pretty cheap. Yeah, they won't work in snow for quite some time. There are things you can do even in snow. Our system actually detects the other vehicles just fine in snow. I didn't bring that video. But yes, if you're trying to follow the lane in snow, I drove across the Grapevine in my Tesla. It drives autonomously all the way to LA except for the 20 minutes through the Grapevine in the snowstorm. So yes.
Which is why you still have to be able to take control once.
Well, you still need your license, yes.
So here's kind of a social question. So what is the job displacement potential of autonomous vehicles and the new mobility apps? What are your thoughts on this concern? Are there any underlying changes that need to be made to our, are there examples of past technology that have had similar impact on jobs, and how did we overcome them?
Yeah, so the impact is huge. If you look at the US Department of Labor data, the single largest job category is truck driver. It's about 4 million people in the US employed that way, still today. Now, in a way, we won't have this problem immediately because there's a huge driver shortage in the US. Because, by the way, it's not a very attractive job. You're away from your family, you're driving on the road all the time, you're stuck in congestion all the time. So there's not a lot of people clamoring for that job category right now. So we have a few years of buffer. But yes, in the long run, we're going to see huge job destruction from people driving. It just won't be a career anymore. By the way, it's going to happen to a lot of other jobs where AI and automation can kick in. And it doesn't matter. It's not about bringing the jobs back to the US. It's fundamentally automation destroyed these jobs, and that's going to be here to stay. Now, second half of that question, I wrote a whole book called Resource Revolution looking at these productivity shifts. And the most interesting analogy, in my view, for what's going to happen is what happened at the turn of the last century. Between 1880 and roughly 1930, before you had the effect of World War II, we industrialized most of this country. You went from an era where everything was artisan handmade trades, everything was done by local shops, to an area where we had national and multinational corporations. We developed a big banking system where you had interstate commerce on a large scale suddenly. We developed the assembly line. We went to interchangeable parts for more than weapons. We actually built all our elevators, all our ships, everything that way suddenly. We displaced the artisan by the assembly line and by the machine. If you look at what happened economically, we had huge unemployment at the end of the 19th century, right? The first benefit went to the rich, because for about 10 years, you had Victorian servants, you had electric light, indoor plumbing, and automated elevators. And you remember that famous scene in old movies where you have the elevator that has the push buttons, but you still have the guy there pushing the buttons for you, right? That was that era. And if you were rich, it was phenomenal. Now, initially, there was a negative hit. We had lots of labor disputes. Unions were formed at that time to protect workers. Lots of people were displaced because machines made things better. But if you look over the next 2 decades, basically one generation roughly, you created a lot more jobs in other skill areas. So that labor was absorbed by new categories, by new services. Suddenly, you could actually have much bigger markets. You had all kinds of new services come up. You had delivery, entire new product categories. So we're going to see the same thing. If transportation goes from $3 a mile to 8 cents a mile and is available to everybody, think about the knock-on effect that has on the rest of the economy. If you just look at here, right, DoorDash, Amazon, all these things that now come by transportation, they're enabled by low-cost transportation. They'll be autonomous. There won't be drivers there, but it creates other job categories. Now, there's a footnote, which is if you just automated transportation, I'm 100% confident the benefit to the rest of the economy of transportation getting efficient and cheap and very safe would definitely be a big positive boom and create lots of jobs. But transportation isn't the only thing being automated. We're automating all our paralegals, we're automating all of our medical diagnostics, we're automating a lot of other job functions that today require a human brain and tomorrow won't. That macro effect on so many different types of job categories at the same time, not just manufacturing or just transportation, we don't know yet what the outcome of that will be. So I think there is a risk there of so many of these things happen at the same time. That's kind of the broader AI question. But just for transportation, to come back to the question, I'm optimistic the net benefit and the net jobs creation actually will be good, but there is a real 20-year period of big adjustment here.
Okay, great. So we're going to now open it to the floor. And the first question down here in the front row, Robert? You bet. Yeah, just wait for the mic to be brought to you and ask your question. Go ahead.
My name is Bob Russell, Sydney University, not MIT, but very interesting talk. You convinced me. As a lifelong, very happy driver, I see a somewhat difficult transition period. How do you envision the autonomous vehicles intermixing with people-driven vehicles? It seems to me there will have to be separate lanes on which human-driven vehicles are not permitted because they are obviously inferior drivers, reaction times,
Yep.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So broadly speaking, I think there's 4 phases. The first phase, which we're already into, is that we'll see autonomy come in for highway driving. Highways, if you think about them, are already highly structured, highly regulated environment, right? Few on and off ramps. There's not a lot of cross traffic or no cross traffic in a limited access freeway. We've got mostly relatively clear lane marking, not everywhere in the world, but certainly here. And so there you can intermix. You can drive autonomously in a Tesla or in a Google car today. They have to mostly drive like people. They don't perfectly drive like people today, but yes. And that's right. The second is highly circumscribed areas at low speed, a corporate campus, a college campus. You know, Google has done it throughout Mountain View, right? Where you've done a lot of pre-calculation. You generally don't have really crazy foot traffic. It's not like downtown New York or downtown Bombay. Those are much harder to handle with autonomous. But in those places, it works early. And so we'll see that. We'll see that at airports. We'll see that in pedestrian zones. Mixing pedestrian foot traffic with autonomous cars actually works better than mixing other cars. So that's stage 1. Stage 2 is to broaden that out. And what we'll see is a couple cities in the world will actually upgrade to be all autonomous. There's a number of European cities that are basically saying my downtown core will become pedestrian and shared autonomous van buses entirely. Singapore is going to upgrade, large parts of its downtown core to run that way. And similarly, you'll see on highways that the next step will be what you just described, which is these autonomous only lanes, right? You won't be able to enter them or not allowed to enter them as a human because you'll create a mess if you do that. And so whether that's electronically enforced or through cameras, we'll see. I think there's a lot of options there once all these cars are actually that intelligent. But that's this autonomous lane that has the 8x increase in carrying capacity. That has to be autonomous only, right? Then the next stage is the autonomous cars will actually get good enough at mimicking human driving. They'll know whether it's another autonomous car and they can behave like autonomous cars, or whether they're with humans. We're seeing that already, different driving patterns. The famous story about Boston's different to driving than San Francisco, it's real. We see it in the data, right? And if you think about, London versus Bombay, even more different, all right? Snow driving is different. So you'll have different configurations, parameters, software for those different environments. Eventually, in the long run, driving will be like safari parks, right? We will ban human driving on most urban areas, on most congested areas. There'll be reservations where you can go drive. There'll be fake cities that, for those of you who want to reminisce driving in traffic jams, you can go to. It'll be like a theme park. Now, my own view is that world is like another 25, 30 years off, right? So that's quite a ways to go until we get to the point of banning driving. But when the data starts showing that you're killing lots of people by having humans drive, there'll be a lot of pressure to begin to limit that and change it.
Okay, over here, first one down here, the black turtleneck.
Actually, I'd like to question that last point. Today, we could do much more to make cars safer without autonomy, with like A/B type systems, and we're not doing it. And why is that?
Yeah, a lot of it is lack of knowledge, lack of public push, regulatory inertia. There's a lot of reasons, right? I gave the example over dinner that just changing the bumper height for light trucks, SUVs and pickup trucks, would save about 20% of all of the serious accidents in the US, because today they're not at the same height as cars. A lot of other countries have changed that standard, and so that's an easy fix. There's a lot of inertia in the system to make those kinds of changes. I think the difference with autonomous cars is there's a real pull from consumers to have some of the benefits and features. Whereas most of you, if I polled you and said, how much do you care about light truck bumper heights? You'd be like, I don't know, right? And so that's, I think, part of what's different. If you look at the history of car technologies, things that have a convenience and a big safety benefit actually do get more pull-through than sort of pure luxury features or things that are more hidden on the engineering side. So is that guaranteed? No, because if we have a bunch of people kill innocent bystanders with early autonomous cars, we could get a complete regulatory backlash. And autonomous cars could be banned in a lot of places, right? I hope that doesn't happen. That's why I'm encouraging every manufacturer to be very responsible in what they do. That's why we started not driving autonomously today, but just simply following human driving, because we're not ready to do full autonomous driving. I don't think anybody is ready to do full autonomous driving under any conditions today. So you have to be very careful about what you claim, right? Is it really universal autopilot? Even a Google car, somebody said earlier, right, isn't going to be good in a snow situation, isn't going to be good in a downtown Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. So we need to be careful to introduce this in the right way so that we don't freak people out. The truck example that I showed, a lot of people are really scared. What do I do on the highway if I run into this road train of 6 trucks? Peloton, by the way, who's just up the road here in Silicon Valley, has been very careful. If somebody tries to pass, the trucks will actually separate to make room for that individual car to pass. I think that's a very thoughtful way of thinking about integrating into the existing traffic flow pattern. Wow, there's a lot of questions now.
Yeah.
You guys have loosened up now.
So if we get convoys of self-driving cars on the highways, right, so they're closely spaced, will we be able to run those convoys at much higher speeds? Okay, and what kind of gain will we get if they're drafting one another in terms of efficiency that way as well?
Yeah.
Has that been looked at?
Yeah, so as far as I know, nobody's looked at that for random passenger cars. There are companies that have looked at this, Peloton, Mitsubishi, Volvo, for trucks. And the benefits for trucks are pretty big. The lead truck gains about 4% fuel efficiency. The following truck gains 11% fuel efficiency, which if you're thinking about a typical commercial truck fleet where the fuel bill can be tens of millions of dollars every year, that starts to be very significant fuel savings, 10% savings. It winds up being about 8 or 9% on a total fleet average. So it's a big component.
Up there in the got a burgundy sweater.
Would you comment on culture and say in terms of sharing versus individualistic patterns, and is there any places in the world where you think sharing is much more prevalent to do with cultural reasons, or is it strictly economics in your mind?
So I don't think it's strictly economics. As I said, relatively rich Stanford students who got given a car actually prefer sharing. So it's not mainly an economic phenomenon. There is a bit of what's the cultural norm and what's the practice, right? If you're used to taking public transit, you're likely to do that in the future. If you're used to being chauffeured, and you have a different transition and a different view towards cars. The bigger effect to me is actually generational here. Ownership has a very different meaning for millennials and for younger generations. I see this in my own daughter as well. I think it's very hard to convince the 50-year-old German retiree or 60-year-old German retiree to give up their car that they've always owned for the rest of their life, right? So there's a generational transition. Your question alludes to the fact that there are also regional differences, right? In a lot of places around the world, people already share. And if you've traveled to Asia, have seen 2, 3, 4 people on a little scooter, right? Probably none of us would do that. And so, yeah, there's different incentive, although those things can go in mysterious ways. Beijing had an incredible number of people bicycling and sharing and riding buses. And now that's actually one of the places where car ownership and individual car ownership is really hot. And they're not actually interested in car sharing to the same degree that we're seeing even here in San Francisco. So I think the net answer is going to be it's very uneven. But the macro trend, I think, towards the younger generation being willing to share for convenience and for benefit is there. It will take time, though. This is definitely a generational change. I'm not expecting everybody to say, you know what, I'll share my car, I'll share my house, I'll share, all of my other favorite gadgets.
There, white shirt. No, oh, okay. Other white shirt.
My question is, I'm over 65, so maybe it's an age thing, but I dearly love to drive into the countryside, to the mountains, out to the desert, Moab in Utah, and how am I going to be able to do this? Or did the millennials never go out there?
They go out there with goggles, VR goggles. Yeah. So I think you give a perfect example, right? Sharing is going to take longer in rural areas, both because of the distances and the densities, but also because that's where driving is still very pleasurable, right? So people, and what you see in the car commercials, that beautiful drive through the countryside and the wonderful scenery, that's what the driving we love, right? And so even millennials, you see them going to Zipcar and renting a car for that beautiful trip into the countryside. So I think that will coexist for a long time. And I think that's why I said in my sort of 4 phases, driving will first get banned in the really dangerous, dense urban areas where it is causing lots of accidents. If you look at the accident rate per mile in the rural areas, it's much smaller. And most of it has nothing to do with other cars. You look at data from the Midwest, it's animal strikes. And it will take a while for autonomous cars to tell the deer to get out of the way. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, I think we'll have that mixed mode. You'll ride Uber in the city or an autonomous car, but then you'll go drive yourself.
Well, are autonomous cars going to be cheap enough eventually that I can own my own and drive out in the country?
I think they will. But it'll take quite a while for them to get that cheap. And we're talking about 10, 15 years. But they will.
So Google's one of the companies that's really big into this autonomous vehicle initiative, and yet fundamentally they're an advertising company. So I'd like to get your opinion on how much of the business value proposition is related to the marketing and advertising data, and related to that, like, what are the privacy issues related to communicating autonomous vehicles?
Well, I mean, I can't speak to Google's plans. They've publicly said it's not about sending you advertising while you're riding in the autonomous car. So, but as for future business models, I don't know. In our case, none of our business models dependent on advertising. We take the privacy very, very seriously. Where you go, and particularly where you park and when you park in different places, is extremely sensitive. In our business, we share that only, because remember, it's commercial vehicles, not private citizens. We share that only with the fleet. And in that context, the fleet is tracking where the cars are and where their drivers are going for deliveries. It has a safety benefit, actually, because you want to make sure that driver is safe and isn't stuck. And our device allows the driver also to trigger an alert if something dangerous happens, a weird passenger gets on board, or they get stuck or held up. Broadly speaking, for autonomous cars in the future, I think we're going to need the same privacy restrictions, right? You won't want to be able to look up the history of everywhere you went in your autonomous car. That won't be a good thing. We certainly don't want our government or any other government to have that data for everybody on the planet. But that's a relative, architecturally we do that just by making sure we forget stuff and we abstract stuff. We keep patterns like traffic patterns, safety risk patterns. We build heat maps of how risky are different intersections in the city. If you go to San Francisco, adjacent intersections can differ by 1,000-fold in the risk. Crossing Market Street at 6th versus crossing at 4th is dramatically different in risk. So those are the kinds of data that you want to keep. Most people, when I've talked to them, have said, look, as long as it's not my personal details, all that other data, that's great that you're sharing that because everybody will get better, right? We learn about the risk hotspots, the traffic, the construction zones, every car talking to every other car to upload that. That's great. We get a real benefit for that. I don't plan to build a business model on advertising, although there is going to be a lot more free time in cars that people will do something with. So whether that's a Netflix or a Google opportunity, I don't know.
Yeah, in your discussion about safety benefits from automation, you implied some level of perfection on the part of the software that's going to be doing the driving. And you talked about maybe 10 times better than what we have today. Well, if we just look at today's traffic statistics, the fatal crashes occur longer than 1 in 3 million hours of driving. What do you have to do to prove that you're going to be 1 in 30 million hours of driving?
Yep.
How do you actually get to that point?
Yeah. So first of all, it's very condition and circumstance dependent, right? Snow is a lot harder, traffic congestion is a lot harder than open highway with very little traffic. I think you're right. The burden of proof should be, I think today under current NHTSA regulation, is on the manufacturer to certify that they're capable of doing that. Part of our collaboration with the OEMs that we're working with is to get very large amounts of data on these really rare events. Fatalities are 100 million miles apart, thank goodness. But that means you need lots and lots of data to really validate that a car is safe. Now, how do you get that? You don't actually want to test drive a car that's not mature yet on public roads and try it out that way. So we're collecting data from events from human-driven cars. Our view is you need hundreds of billions of miles of real-world experience to actually really be able to prove that something is 5 or 6 nines safe. The only way to collect that is from commercial vehicles. That's part of the reason for our model. And then you can run that against your algorithms in simulation and in test scenarios and then gradually expand from there. You can't do it with pure simulation because all of these very rare but real edge cases still come to haunt you, and so you need a way to actually get real data from what actually happens on roads. That's really, really important. And I think, again, that best algorithms build in an estimation of certainty, and you can build a backup behavior that says, I'm going to do something that is safe even if I don't know exactly what to do in this situation. Right? It's the classic, hey, if I've arrived at a new construction site and I don't know what the safe path to go is, I'd rather stop and slow down and call for help, or have the human take back over, or even have a remote center look at it and take over. So there's lots of safe behaviors that you can build in. That's why I think it's irresponsible to say, hey, for $1,000 I can retrofit your car with something that drives autonomously everywhere. That's not really a good approach for society.
Okay, so we got 2 people right in front of each other, so let's let them both go. First, no, keep going. That's right, okay. And then if you would hand the microphone to the gentleman in front of you after you're done, we'll do it that way.
All right, so I'm actually the proud driver of a 5-speed stick shift, so this is dinosaur technology. But I'm really curious, you mentioned totally new infrastructure being built for new cities, totally optimized for autonomous driving. I'm kind of curious, what would that look like in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, I'll give you a little example. There's a developer renovating Park Merced up in San Francisco, near San Francisco State. Historically, under U.S. code, New York is kind of an exception. We require a minimum amount of parking surface and parking spaces for every square foot of living space. And so we kind of designed our infrastructure like that Cisco picture I showed, right? You got to have a minimum of parking. Again, some downtown areas, New York is famous for inverting that. There's a maximum of parking per square footage that you're allowed to build. I think we'll gradually move more and more to that metric. So what they've done is car sharing, Zipcar, and Uber comes in your basement. There's a drop-off and pickup area. And that every owner who buys into this development actually gets a monthly credit in terms of ride-sharing rides. Right, so that's sort of the beginnings of that kind of model. What would a whole city look like? Well, we'd have a lot more green space. We'd have a lot more vertical travel through elevators. We have, I used to live in Manhattan for a couple of years. We had a grocery store and a gym and a pool in the same building, right? So you traveled there by elevator. Now in New York that's common, a lot of other cities that's not. The big thing that goes away is all of that storage space for cars, all of the other infrastructure that's really evolved in the last 50, 60 years. If you look, there's a great video from right before the San Francisco earthquake, 1906, just before the earthquake, that somebody shot just riding down Market Street. And the amazing thing is, all of Market Street was public space that people had conversations in, that people had street vendors and stalls in, and people were walking everywhere across Market Street. Right? Today we've said, no, all you pedestrians, get out onto the sides. You have like 4 or 5 feet of space. Then we got now bike lanes, big innovation, right? And then in the middle we have Muni, and then we have the 2 car lanes. So we've kind of segregated those space uses. So what does the autonomous city look like? That will all be blended again. By the way, there's some cities that have already started doing that. Vienna has taken 2 of its busiest streets that were big shopping streets as well, and said you're not allowed to cut through to get to another place, but if you're driving locally, you're allowed to go into the middle of a pedestrian zone, but you can only go 15 kilometers per hour, and you're just in the middle of the people. It actually works. It reduces accidents. It's dramatically boosted revenues of all the shops there. It's allowed bikers to share the road with vehicles. Autonomous cars can deal with those kinds of situations. At 15 miles per hour with a bunch of pedestrians and bikers around, the technology actually works pretty well. It's one of the cases where it works well, as opposed to what we normally see, which is 45 mile per hour arterials, where people are actually going 55 miles per hour, and it's really dangerous because you don't have that visibility. But there's more innovation to come. I think we'll see even new kinds of cities that we really haven't even experienced. Who could have predicted in 1880 what our cities would look like in 1950?
Okay, down there.
Yeah, to say I enjoyed your presentation and the tremendous amount of work and thought that has been put into it, and inclusion of social, generational, and historical factors. I want to ask you if there are, and as food for thought for all the entrepreneurs here, if there are key technologies that are missing that are gating the development of this. And that's aside from precision, real-time positioning and communication, which is obvious. It's my own work.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a fantastic question. I do think there's a lot of those examples. Being able to locate yourself, being able to map at high precision, being able to have high bandwidth communication from lots of different moving vehicles, right? These new kinds of dynamic mesh networks. Being able to schedule and optimize essentially sort of virtual cross-docking facilities, right? A lot of the traffic in cities is people loading and unloading goods for stores. If you live in any major city, most of your traffic jams during the early morning hours, the sort of 8 a.m. to noon period, is every single manufacturer for every store bringing in a truck and unloading one type of good. And there's 20 trucks that will go by the store for all the different things that they replenish, right? Why couldn't we do all that in a shared system, sort of like our Amazon packages, right, which all come on the same UPS truck? So that's an example. Speaking of cargo, the single biggest inhibitor today for people selling their car and going entirely with Uber or Lyft is stuff. People use their car to store stuff, right? I got my golf clubs, I got my sports gear, I've got my kid's diaper bag, all that stuff is in my car. So I've said the next big Uber is somebody who figures out how to turn that into a fungible package that can go from one Uber to another, so that you can call for your Uber ride with your golf gear, and boom, there it is, right? Or whatever your favorite hobby is. I think there's a lot of opportunities around the optimization of what do we do with parking and how do we enable electric vehicle charging. For people who have home charging, it's pretty easy. I charge my Tesla once a week. I love it. I never go to a gas station. It's more convenient than a gasoline car because I literally plug it in once a week. The rest of the week I don't have to think about it. It's right at home. It doesn't take more than 3 seconds to plug it in. But if you're in an apartment building or you don't have a place to park, that's still a big inhibitor. So how does that model get solved? So there's lots of these. Sharing can be broadened to offices. I didn't talk about buildings. The buildings have about 20% utilization on average. Even in your homes, what's the utilization of your dining room? It's terrible for most places. Yeah, a lot of people don't have dining rooms. They have dens and family rooms. That's right. So there's a lot of these kinds of opportunities that I think come with this shift.
Okay, we're going to just have to allow one more question because it's 9:15. And then I have 2 quick ones for you that are part of the ones that were asked online. Well, Fred, I was going to give you the question.
I'll just yell. You see all these technologies enabling significantly faster vehicles. Well above our nominal 65, actual 75.
Yeah. So technically they could. Because again, if you're paying perfect attention and you've got all these sensors that can look far down the road, you can definitely go faster. Somebody said that earlier already, that autonomous only highway lane, we might be able to raise the speed to 75, 85 miles per hour and do it safely. I don't know that we will because again, the interaction with the rest of the urban environment matters. I think on highways, probably yes. So the earlier question about the long haul convoys, yeah, those will probably go even faster than they do today and will do so safely. Even today, the decision that Tesla made to in the latest autopilot upgrade to limit your autopilot to the speed limit of the road, I've tweeted publicly about this. I think it's a terrible decision. It's one dominated by the lawyers because speed limits are set at the 85th percentile of actual speeds. So now I and my autonomous Tesla become a bottleneck that everyone else has to cut around. It's first of all a terrible user experience, of course, because all these guys are looking at you going, you jerk. But also you're actually less safe. The best speed to go is the speed of the flow of traffic. So we evaluate drivers who are too slow or too fast above the speed of traffic as more risk. And that can be either way. On a rainy day in California, that's well below the speed limit. That's the optimal speed because everybody else is slow. But for a typical day, that's slightly above the speed limit that actually is the optimal speed. So I think the speed limits overall would become a more dynamic thing. So just like the intersection I showed, speed limits would become digital and context sensitive. How much traffic is there? What are the weather conditions? What time of day is it? And that's really the right answer too, right? We sort of have put speed limits in for the worst case scenario. The one example, by the way, that is already in the right direction are school speed limits, right? The sign says, 25 miles per hour when school is in session, and it's a dynamic element. You don't slow to that speed on a Sunday, but we'll see a lot more of that.
Okay, when do you envision a 600-mile range electric vehicle?
So I think we're right on the cusp of getting 200 to 250 mile range vehicles. The Tesla, the Bolt, as I mentioned. That's really the meaningful break point for the user experience. Because where most of the electric cars have been 40 to 80 mile range, you have massive range anxiety. Almost every trip still takes you to the limit. Right? When you get to where a lot of new cars are now, 110, 150 mile range, you still have range anxiety if you commute further or if you're taking a bigger trip. You don't for your typical commute to work. The average trip in the US is a little over 12 miles, so with a 100-mile range, 12-mile trip is not going to cause you range anxiety. But at 200, 250-mile range, most of your trips are now going to be in range, particularly if you then have a highway supercharging type network. You feel pretty comfortable. I've used superchargers 3 times in the year and a half I've owned my Tesla. Basically to go to LA and to go to Napa Valley and to go to Tahoe. The rest of the time you don't need it. 600 miles, I think realistically we probably won't need 600 miles. Technically, I think we can do 600 miles in a little more than a decade, maybe 12 years, something like that. But again, most people won't want that vehicle. It might be a vehicle that you swap into in your sharing system for that trip to Tahoe, so that you have to charge less often on your way there. But you're not actually going to want to carry around the weight of a 600-mile vehicle for your daily trip and commute. So that'll be more like a special purpose vehicle. I think for most people, the 300-mile range, maybe 400-mile range will be plenty sufficient, and we'll have a different preference point, I think. So.
All right. And finally, do fuel cell cars fit into your vision in any way?
I'm a big skeptic about hydrogen and fuel cells because every time I've looked at the economics, batteries are out ahead. I think that the infrastructure upgrade required for fuel cells is much bigger than the infrastructure required for charging. We have, I think, 17 or 19 hydrogen stations in California, and we're by far away ahead in the rest of the country. And there really isn't a big benefit. So the theoretical benefit of, okay, I have a solar power plant that then creates hydrogen, that then allows me to have this big gas tank equivalent to go anywhere. Batteries are going to catch up to the discussion we just had, right? We'll have enough range, so we don't need that. I can plug an electric car in pretty much anywhere in the country already and at least get a low level of charging, and pretty soon we'll be able to get a decent rate of charging. That recharges a 200-mile car in 4 or 5 hours. That's plenty for overnight charging. And you've got superchargers in there equivalent that can charge the full range in 20, 25 minutes, and that's good enough. And then hydrogen has lots of costs. The catalysts are very expensive for the fuel cells. So unless that some other product is the equivalent of the mobile phone and brings fuel cells down on a massive scale for another application, I'm dubious that cars alone will wind up going that route.
Which is probably why we're not going to do an event on
Fuel cells.
cell vehicles anytime soon. All right, well, let's give a big hand to Dr. Hope.
Thank you.